Good morning, everybody. My name is Neil Grooby, Developer Evangelist at Xero, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series that's just starting today, which is currently going to be the OAuth preview for 2.0. It's something that Xero has been working on for a while. So just a brief introduction to myself. My name is Neil Grooby, Developer Evangelist at Xero Australia, based in Melbourne. I've been with Xero for 2.5 years. My focus primarily is around the fintech space, but I have done a lot of ecosystem. So a lot of the participants today may or may not have already spoken to me in the past. So for those who are there listening, thank you for taking the time out. For those new participants, we're certainly happy to have you tuning in today. One of the things I would really like to understand as part of this, so that I can target some of my webinar content, is around what people are actually here to hear about. So it'll be really good in terms of people being able to use the poll facility that we've got now, which is around, are you actually using OAuth 1.0a, or are you actually just here to learn about OAuth 2.0 and the Xero API? So if you can take the opportunity, that'll be most appreciated, so we can understand who our audience are. Thank you very much. So today, the agenda that we're going to talk about is around OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 and the comparison between the two, the important concepts of OAuth 2, the Xero API, and an OAuth 2 demo. So I'm going to preface that OAuth 2 demo and say it's actually without SDK support, and the reason for that is actually to show you how easy it is to use OAuth 2, not to talk about the Xero API, and I will talk about that at the end. We're also going to talk about single sign-on and single sign-up, and then we'll talk about a summary. So thank you very much for your poll results. It's actually really good to see those people who are actually here to learn about the Xero OAuth 2.0 and also those participants. It's almost a 50-50 split in terms of people. So that is really good to see those people who are using the Xero API and those who are here to learn what's coming down the pipe in terms of Xero API and OAuth 2.0. So firstly, a version comparison between OAuth 1a, which has been the backbone of Xero's API for a substantial amount of our time that we've been developing the API, and 2.0. So the functionality that some developers who have gone through our full certification process to actually take your product through to partner is going and actually uploading a certificate file. So one of the key tenets of OAuth 1a is actually generating an OpenSSL certificate, uploading that, and getting back a consumer secret and a consumer key. That's created a really secure environment for actually communicating with Xero. This consumer key and the consumer secret obviously get uploaded to Xero, so it has that information, but it also needs to be deployed into your own infrastructure, which has created some significant challenges in the past. We also are aware that for some of our larger customers, that creation of the OpenSSL certificate is actually a complex thing to actually get through your own internal processes, but it's also a lot of steps that need to be done, especially when you're actually doing new deployments. And the last one is that we don't have a really good way of authorizing access to the resources. So now we compare it with 2.0. 2.0. Okay, uses HTTPS. So that security is actually the underlying certificate of HTTPS. So that means that most people, if people have been looking at Google, will see that most of their requirements these days are a reliance on any website having HTTPS. So OAuth 2 leverages HTTPS, which means that certificate file doesn't need to be deployed as part of your ongoing deployment. That also will obviously make it significantly easier for doing your dev staging and production systems as well, because the HTTPS is intrinsic within that. You got a common certificate file effectively with that. It's simple to implement. Okay, so there's less steps that are required, and it's highly scalable and adaptable. OAuth 1.0, you know, had grand plans to be able to support desktop, mobile, etc. Because of the fact that it was found to have some security holes in it, it really never got there. OAuth 2 supports that through different types, but it's highly scalable and adaptable because it actually resides on the existing infrastructure HTTPS. We can authorize access to resources with scopes. We'll talk about scopes a little bit later, and the scopes that Xero has enabled in there. And one of the massive features that comes with OAuth 2A is authentication using OpenID Connect. So single sign-on, single sign-up credentials are actually exposed as part of the OAuth 2 functionality. So what's changed? For those who have used previously, you needed to go and put a certificate file for 1A. Under 2.0, you have just a client ID and a client secret. Xero actually manages that process when you actually go and create an application, and you'll actually be able to copy and paste those directly into your code. And we'll actually do an example, one of those, when we actually do the live demo. We also have these scopes. So scopes give a significant amount of information around what the application is trying to access. As we move into this privacy world, the consent form and the consent screen that a lot of applications are focused on, especially with some of the recent data breaches, is quite important as we move into consumer data right here in Australia, and also GDPR in the UK. They're quite significant things to focus on the privacy related aspect. And then we have a redirect URL, which is the callback. And we use that for authorization. That really hasn't changed significantly between the version 1.0A and version 2. The only difference is that you can redirect primarily to a HTTPS, which is your underlying, as opposed to the example that's shown on screen there. So, as I mentioned before, Xero will generate the client ID and the client secret, and I'll show you the UI and how's that changed within the My Apps area within the Xero Developer Platform. You need to define your scopes, and I'll show you at the end some resources which actually identify the different scopes and their use. And then you obviously got to define your redirection URL. In terms of authorization flow between 1.0A, as we talked about before, you've got a private key, public key pair that is generated as a result of the certificate file for OAuth 1.0A. And there's a significant amount of handshaking that is required in order to be able to do that, which is your request token, a verification, you get an access token ultimately delivered. Under OAuth 2, HTTPS is the underlying certificate which on which it actually resides upon, and the user actually gets user grants and an access grant. So you get an authorization grant and then you can access grant. Most of this functionality is very simple to implement, and you'll see that we anticipate that OAuth 2 changes are not significant, in fact significantly easier when using OAuth 2, and we'll show you some example code using HTTP client in the demo system. So as I mentioned, you've got a redirection for the authorization user access grants in 1.0A, and then you've got a grant access token and an access token which is delivered. Under OAuth 2, you actually have a simplified version of that, in that the HTTPS managers are part of that, and the redirection occurs. So verifier and all of that stuff is all magically handled. So we're now going to do a demo. So we're going to do this demo as an end-to-end demo with a little bit of a little bit of information around how that all works. And I'll just switch over my screen here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually in my apps, and I'm actually going to go and create. And when anyone who's logged into the developer portal under their My Apps, you'll now see this new button, which is try OAuth version 2. Okay, and this is a really easy thing to do. Okay, so I'm just going to go and select my example one here. I'm going to use my example.com. I'm not going to fill in a privacy policy, and I'm going to direct back to my OAuth, which is using HTTPS. And for those who aren't familiar with it, who haven't read the developer platform terms and conditions, I've read it many times. I'd recommend you have a read of that. And then we're going to create the application. Once the application is made, right, and we can just, excuse me a minute, I'll just drop the zoom on this. You'll see here we can actually generate the secret, and we can go and copy that information. I'm going to copy that information into a code sample that I've got here. So you'll see here we've actually got the client ID. We're going to paste that in there, and we're going to copy the secret. And again, we'll paste that in there. So that's all we actually need to do in order to actually set it up. We'll obviously click on save. Okay, and you can see the client secret is actually hidden there. You can actually create multiple if you wanted to by actually removing that. So once we've actually done that, we can actually, we've got a standard .NET MVC application that we've created by doing a .NET new web API, web app, and from that we're able to then go and create the functionality that we want to support in order to be able to support OAuth. So you've seen previously I've gone and dropped the client ID and the client secret. Okay, we also need to fill in the redirect URL, and you can see that that's actually down here. So this is actually the functionality that supports that OAuth. The important thing that I'd like to talk to you about around is this state here. So one of the things that you should be aware of is cross-site forgery. And what we've done is, for this example, we've just put in a sample string, but really in order to be able to prevent cross-site forgery, you probably want to do something a little bit more funky than that. My recommendation would be to have a look at hashing algorithms, potentially with a salt encryption. Other things that I've heard about is people actually using date time stamps, which even down to the millisecond are not necessarily unique, but they're certainly an option. So this is going to handle the get, and this here is going to handle the OAuth component to that. So what we might do is we might just actually terminate this here, and we'll actually go and make sure that everything is saved. So we've got those new consumer key and consumer secrets, and we'll come in here and we'll actually do a build. One thing I'd like you to do is actually to, while I'm doing this and you're demonstrating, if you've got the opportunity, I'd really be interested in what people are actually using for their underlying language. So we're going to put up a poll here so that we can actually understand what people are actually doing as part of their development language. So we can actually understand who's using, say, .NET, PHP, Ruby, etc. So by all means, if you can take a time there, it would actually greatly assist Xero to understand who's using what particular language. I'm really interested in those people who are actually putting down other, and we might take some of those conversations offline to understand that. All right, so now I'll just move my poll out the way. Right, so now what I've done is I've done the build of that. I'm now going to run it. And I'm now going to come into here, and you'll see I've got a listen port on 5000, so that'll be ultimately my index. I'm going to now launch that. And I'm going to come into, yeah, I notice that some people are putting up their hands. If you can just hold over any questions until later, please, and we'll certainly get to you. So I'm going to just come in here, and I'm going to go into my sample application. I'm going to connect up to Xero. So if you have a look at what I've got actually underlying this button, I'll just go back here. And I'm actually going to copy the link address of that. And I'll just paste that here. So one thing you'll actually see when you're actually looking at it, you'll actually see all your scopes, your state, your local host, etc. is all there. So that's why it's important to actually have your state there so that you can actually verify it, but it also has all of the scope information there. And that's how we actually are able to identify that. When we actually come in and we do the connect to Xero, I can now come in and I can allow access. Now, we have a basic information, but as part of the scopes that we've passed in, you can actually get a little bit more information. So part of the scopes is we want to be able to view file library, organization setting, attachments, business transactions, contacts. And what the scopes, if we come back to the scopes here that we've passed in, you'll see we've got a pile of scopes that are passed in as parameters. I'll explicitly talk about these three later when I'm talking about the identity. But you also can see we've got the accounting transactions, we've got the ability to read accounting transactions, the accounting reports, journals, etc. There's a lot of scopes that are available in here. So I'll just scroll to the end there and you can see accounting attachments, offline access for files, etc. and journals. So I'm going to now authorize just my demo company. And we'll now authorize that and we'll do a connection. So what we've done is we've actually done a full OAuth flow, which is actually connected. It's called back onto that OAuth and we've got some functionality. I'll actually go through a little bit more of the code. It shouldn't matter which language you're using because this is ultimately just JSON objects that are being displayed right here. It shouldn't present too many issues for too many programmers, I wouldn't have thought. So what I've done here is I've got the callback that's come into the OAuth. Okay, I've gone and got a list of tenants that are connected. So one of the key things that OAuth 2 has is this mechanism where the user is actually the person who has the authorization, not the user and the organization. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we actually go through the presentation. But you'll see here we can actually get a list of tenants that are connected. So at the present time, I've only connected one tenant, as you saw, and I'm just dumping that information here. So all I'm doing is calling out that information. And as a result of that, I have got this little function here, which I've written, which is calling out against that. So we have the Xero tenant ID, which if it's not passed in as null, it will actually specifically target that tenant ID. And that's what we're doing in here, trying to get the organization information and the invoices information. So if we go back and have a look at the information that's presented here, what we can see is we've got this tenant ID. Okay, so this is a GUID here, but we also have the tenant type, which is an organization. This information is important and it will flow back into the presentation a little bit later as to why this tenant type is important. It's also, for those who have been using OAuth 1A are familiar with the concept of an organization ID. And the reason why in this demo I actually specifically pushed out as a JSON object the tenant ID, because that tenant ID is actually the organization IDs. Sorry, this tenant ID here is the same as this organization ID. So for those people who have been using the organization ID as a primary key to store the session and token information in OAuth 1A, you should still be able to utilize that as your primary key. That's just your tenant ID there. So that was a really, really simple demo, but let's go and authorize another one. So this time we're actually going to go and authorize a secondary one. So we get the same information here. This time we should be having two connections. So when I do the authorization, I already know that there's one connected organization. Okay, I can click on continue, which will just give me that existing connection, or otherwise I can actually go into here and I can come into here. I'll go into this one here, my Neil Xero, and I'll connect it to that. Okay, so now if we look at that, there's a lot of data admittedly, but you'll actually end up having multiple invoices being presented here. So we should be seeing in here multiple organizations. So in here we are. So you'll see we've got two tenants connected here. So here's your first tenant, and here's your second tenant here. So we've got a mechanism of actually going and getting multiple pieces of information. Quite powerful. And that's why when we go through the code here, you'll see we're actually doing a for each, actually looping through the tenants connected, and we're actually putting the resultant content out. Unfortunately, I should have actually put the resultant content out at the end. So that is a very simple OAuth 2.0 version. The important thing I'd like to highlight is that for those who are already using the Xero API, these endpoints will be very familiar to you. So the organization endpoint, the invoices endpoint. If we come back into here and we look at the docs, and what we will see is the invoices endpoint. That invoices endpoint is exactly the same invoices endpoint that we previously hit. So the difference between OAuth 1A and 2.0 from an endpoint perspective, very, very similar. Okay, so we'll now move back into the presentation. So that was the demo using .NET Standard Edition, up and running in 5 minutes. We do have some information, I'll talk about that later on, around SDKs, but that was actually just using the OAuth 2.0 without using any SDK. So the actual model, user models, or basically the underlying structures, whatever your different languages, your objects, those will actually be deserialized from a JSON object into those. So it'll make them very easy to use. So the key thing that OAuth 2 provides is it's actually a user-based token. So you got one OAuth flow for users, and the key thing that I talked about before is that why an organization is important when we looked at the tenant ID, we can actually extend that to practices. So you can have different types. So those of you who are developing to Xero HQ, the practices component of that will be extended with OAuth 2 as well. So your different types. So for someone who is an accountant who might be managing multiple franchises using Xero HQ, that becomes important. So we sort of touched on this during the demo about the fact that under OAuth 1A, that the access token is actually tied to the user and the organization. The difference is in OAuth 2, the access token is actually tied to the user. That enables a user to actually have multiple tenants, as we saw in the demonstration. It also allows them to, that user to also be tied to, obviously, to practice as well. So just reinforcing that, an access token is tied to the user, and we can see the user account information that's presented as part of that initial authorization. And then you've got multiple tenants. So we touched on the fact that a tenant is no longer just an organization, it's actually an organization of practice under OAuth 2. One of the other things that is a feature of OAuth 2 is, and Xero has already implemented this with a number of existing app partners who participated as part of the ongoing beta program, is actually the ability to actually sign in and sign up with Xero, and that's facilitated by the Open API, sorry, the Open ID. So if I come in back and we actually have a look at a little bit of data that was actually returned as part of the payload in here, we've got this information here, which is the access token, the refresh token, and the identity token, which are all tied against the user. The important one here is actually this identity token that we have here. And I'm just going to copy that. That is actually a JSON web token. And we can actually go into a website called jwt.io. And we can actually go into here, and it's got this wonderful ability to actually paste it. And you'll see we've got who the issuer is. So you can see it's identity@xero.com. You can also see my email address, my preferred username, my given name, and my family name. That allows you to actually grab a little bit of credentials that can either be used for single sign-on or single sign-up. So what we saw in the presentation was the service mode edition of that. And it allows you to actually go on. There's a few others that have had it enabled if you're interested. So that's very, very simple, very, very powerful to actually utilize that functionality. Okay, so now we'll go back and have a quick look at some stuff. One thing you will notice is that Xero is already providing the branding for those who have already been through the process, is already providing the branding for us sign in with Xero. And you can see those being presented there. So in summary, we've looked at OAuth 2 and Xero, but we've looked at it from a JSON object perspective and just how simple it is to get up and running in a .NET environment. That's all well and good, but not many people actually want to utilize bare metal. So what we've actually done is actually create some SDKs. So Xero has already put some documentation on the website and enabled that. And I'll just quickly show you people who have, obviously, significant number of you have used the OAuth 1A implementation, but I'll just do a quick walkthrough of what we've actually provided in terms of documentation. So for those who aren't familiar with the Xero Developer Portal, we have some how-to guides here. So I'm just going to quickly browse to the how-to guides because it has big best practices and branding guides, but it also has, for those who have been observant, would have seen that the OAuth 2 beta information is also available there. One of the key things that we've, as developer evangelists and the API team have been doing is actually creating SDKs around that. So it was very interesting to have a look at the poll results and actually see who was using what languages, because Xero is already providing SDKs for those particular languages. And you know, we will take the feedback around who has participated in this and then look at where we can then generate additional ones. That's why I'm interested as to who's using other, as to whether or not you know, we need to provide that functionality of the box. But as you can see from the demo, relatively simple, especially if you've already got your models up and running. The other thing that we've got is the OAuth flow. So we talked a little bit about how that all works in terms of the authorization code, the access token, the tenant, getting back the tenant IDs. And that's all documented there in terms of the RESTful API. So you can go and talk about it. Scopes. So we sort of lightly touched on scopes, but there's some really, really good functionality that's been delivered as a result of scopes. The Open ID Connect functionality. So when we looked at the source code, I highlighted the first three, and I'll just quickly go back to those scopes. Open ID, profile, and email. So you'll note from the JWT that I was able to get that information because it was actually requested as part of the scope. Then you've got actually your accounting transactions, your accounting read, write. Sorry, write is actually not defined. It's just the dot reads the write is inferred. So you can view and manage. And then you've got your payroll information for UK, NZ, and also for AU, and the files API. One thing that has been asked in the past is around limits. So the limits that we have is that an uncertified app. So previously, a lot of people would have used private, public, and partner. So under OAuth 2, we just have uncertified apps, and the limits that have been identified are quite clearly called out around the number of connected and your daily and your minute limits. And then we also have some additional stuff which is around sign in with Xero, including basically a full step-by-step guide around how to actually create that. Very, very simple, already available on the Xero Developer website. The key takeaway from this is that your SDK is already there. So you can actually start building those today using the SDKs, not going to the bare metal, using the OAuth that we did. All right. So if we come back into here, in summary, Xero OAuth 2.0. to infinity and beyond. Currently, we have over 800 plus certified apps in the app marketplace using OAuth 1A. Obviously, 1A was something that was fit for purpose, but we believe that OAuth 2 is a step up for some of the reasons that we've outlined as part of this presentation. What I'd like to go forward with is we're now going to have a Q&A question. So we will certainly have a look, and we'll probably cherry pick some questions, some specific questions that we actually have for you. For those who aren't aware of who I am, these are my details and also some references. So that's for those who haven't met me in person, that's my beak, that's my photo. I'm also on Twitter. For those who are looking for some support, API@xero.com, and also we have our GitHub repository. Also look for Xero Developer on YouTube and our dev blog, and also our Twitter and Instagram handles. So I'm just going to leave that up, and we're going to go through a couple of questions around this. I've got a question here from Andrew. Hi, I work primarily with private applications in OAuth. Is OAuth 2 recommended over the current OAuth 1A? So going forward, the recommendation is to use OAuth 2 as refresh tokens are built in, and eventually OAuth 1A will not be supported. OAuth 2 will give you persistent authorization like a private app. And we sort of touched on that, glossed over a little bit with the fact that, you can have 25 apps available to you as part of that process. Another question was, will OAuth 2 work with public, private, and partner apps? So that sort of dovetails a little bit into what we talked about. We won't have the concept of public, private, and partner app in 2.0. We just have the restrictions on the number of connections, and you'll need to as soon as you want to go past 25 apps, you'll actually need to go through being listed in the Xero Marketplace. We will probably change a little bit the certification process, but for those who haven't seen it, go to developer.xero.com, the how-to guides. We actually have a full certification how-to guide, which is a really easy way of doing things. The next question that has come through, which is most appreciated for the questions for everybody who's participated too. Will you be able to connect multiple organisations with the OAuth 2 flow at the same time at a company level? At this point, we're only supporting the ability to select one organisation at a time. In terms of webhooks, webhooks aren't currently supported, but will be coming, and we will see those. We don't actually know about a particular ETA on that, but the APIs team is working hard on this. It is definitely on their roadmap, and please keep an eye on the blog for release dates, because I think that's a really good way for those who aren't participating to just get a feel for some of those things to be looking at the dev blog. Another question that we had was, some OAuth providers have an expiry on their refresh tokens and some don't. Do Xero OAuth refresh tokens expire? The refresh token does not expire, or expire once you have used it. So it's pretty simple functionality for OAuth 2. One of the last questions that we're getting towards, because we're sort of getting a little bit close, we might have a bit more time, is around, do we actually have a shutdown time for OAuth 1A? This hasn't been decided yet. Xero is committed to providing OAuth 2, but we won't be abandoning in the short term OAuth 1A. We will be providing more detail as to when that will be deprecated, but the time frame will be allow for a lot of developers to move across, and we will be looking at migration guides to actually move across from OAuth 1A to OAuth 2 as part of our ongoing commitment to the Xero API community. Another question is, will current SDKs be retrofitted? So this sort of feeds into the question that I sort of partially answered, is that we're releasing a new set of SDKs that will work with OAuth 2. So there's currently no plan on retrofitting those, but as I said, we will be looking at the possibility of being able to write migration guides as to what the differences are between obviously different languages require, will require you know, a focus, and those will be released similar to what we did with the TLS migration. How can we migrate without doing much development? We've already sort of covered this off with the migration. It's currently a priority of our team, but we don't have a firm timeline for commitment, but we will actually be announcing that. So following on from what I said before, keep your eyes on dev posts and also the other channels that were actually mentioned there, because they will provide a really, really good idea as to how Xero is doing it and when those are going to be released. So a migration guide is obviously high because of the investment that developers have actually made in the existing SDKs. So we're getting close to the end of the webinar, which has been good to see those really strong questions around what OAuth 2.0 means, and what the path forward for Xero. What I'd like you to do is reach out to us if you have any questions that have not been answered in the webinar. Any questions that we feel actually would be relevant for a wider audience, we'll certainly put that as part of our current DevX experience so that people can actually go and get that, because the questions you're asking are probably going to be questions that will get asked going forward by many developers, those who possibly couldn't have attended today. We actually have saved all your questions, so we will actually be going back and revisiting all those questions. This is the first webinar. We're actually hosting this webinar in just different regions. We've still got 2 more of these to go, so we will be aggregating all of these questions and pulling those together and trying to provide as much information, because there is some really fantastic developers with some really cool ideas out there who are obviously will be trying to use OAuth 2 as part of the Xero API. So we'd like to you know, make that information available to as soon as possible. So it's been fantastic. Really enjoyed your participation, especially your questions. Thank you very much for those who did fill in the polls. We certainly would like you to keep your eye on developer.xero.com, because that's a really good place to look at. If you do have any questions, immediate questions that you feel you need some attention to, please reach out to api@xero.com via email, and we'll hopefully get those answers to you. And I think we've got a really good session. Thank you very much for your attendance. For those who took your time out of your busy days, thank you very much for that, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.